Hi everyone. In the last video, we covered the basics of Spring IOC container. So logically, the next step is to understand beans. Bean is nothing but a class that is managed by the Spring container. What that means is in a Java project, we may have, let's say 20 classes. Now we may not want all those 20 classes to be managed by Spring. So maybe we have the XML configuration file, the Spring configuration files, and in that configuration file, we only configured, let's say 15 classes. So Spring only knows about those 15 classes. It doesn't know there are 20 classes. What Spring will do, it will read that XML file, the configuration file, and it will try to understand the details of all those 15 classes. For that container or for that Spring context, there are only 15 classes. So when we start up the application and when the Spring context initializes, it will try to create or try to instantiate those 15 classes because it knows about them, their dependencies. And those classes managed by Spring are called beans. These are the Spring beans. So logically, they are same as classes. It is exactly same. But because they are managed by Spring, so Spring call them Spring Bean. That's it. It's just the naming. So a class which is managed by Spring is called Spring Bean. Now a bean may or may not have an ID or name. If we provide an ID or if we provide a name, then Spring will use that ID or name to look up the class, to look up the objects when we ask IOC container to provide us a new object of a class. If we don't provide anything, then Spring will auto-generate the name or the ID for a class or for a bean that is being managed by Spring. So in the last video, when we saw this example, here we say that context.getBean, we are calling the getBean method to get a new object of a class. Then we are providing this ID and it will be the ID that we defined in the application configuration.xml, which is abc.xml in this case. This is the ID that we give for this bean definition. All right. Now let's see a quick example from the documentation. So here we see an example of XML configuration. The root tag is beans. It means this class, this configuration manages the beans. Now in XML configuration, to define a bean, we use the bean tag. So this is a single bean. It has an ID which is given by us. Then it has the class attribute which has the fully qualified class name of the class that we want to be managed by Spring. So in this case, this is the class that will be managed by Spring, and this is simply called a bean, a Spring bean with this ID. Similarly, there could be another bean or multiple beans with ID or name attribute and the class. Okay, now that we have a slight idea of how the XML config looks like, what are the Spring beans, let's see how to work with container. Although we saw the example, but let's see from the documentation. So here is an example. We create the application context. We use the class path XML application context in this case because we are using XML configuration. Then we provide the name of XML file. Once we have the Spring context, we call the getBean and we pass an ID. All right, we call the getBean method where we pass the ID and the class so that it doesn't have to typecast. And in return, we get an object of the pet store service class, which is managed by Spring. And then we can do everything on that object, which is supported by the class. There are other things that we need to understand about beans, but we will see them in future videos. So in this video, we saw what is a Spring bean, how is it different from a class. So technically there is no difference. The only difference is that the beans are managed by Spring. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.